The morning Elvira Keene loaded her rifle alone on the porch of the Keene homestead. The dust from the Callaway riders was already rising on the eastern ridge like a warning written in the language of dirt and threat, and she had no intention of backing down from it. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches of sun-bronzed determination, her dark hair pinned back in a loose braid that had not seen a proper mirror in 3 days, wearing her late father's canvas work coat over a faded blue dress. The rifle was a Winchester Model 1873, the lever action smooth from years of use, and she held it the way her father Samuel Keene had taught her stock firm, against her shoulder, barrel steady, eyes level and unafraid. Samuel Keene had died in the spring of 1882, leaving behind 40 acres of good grazing land in the hill country south of Laredo, Texas, a weathered farmhouse, a small herd of cattle, and a daughter who had inherited every stubborn fiber of him. The year was 1883, and the Texas frontier was no place for sentiment or softness, a lesson Elvira had been learning with grinding repetition since the day they put her father in the ground. The 3 riders reined in their horses at the edge of her property line, where the rotting fence posts marked the boundary she had repaired twice already this summer. The man in front was Carter Callaway's foreman, a wide-shouldered, mustached fellow named Dade Reese, who wore his contempt for Elvira openly, like a badge he was proud of. The 2 men flanking him were ranch hands she recognized, but did not know by name, young men who looked uncomfortable doing Reese's bidding and knew better than to say so. "Miss Keene," Reese called out, his voice carrying the particular laziness of a man who believes he holds all the cards. "Mr. Callaway sends his regards. He also sends another offer. $800 for the 40 acres, clean deed transfer, and you walk away to wherever you want to go." Elvira lowered the rifle just enough to make eye contact. "You can ride back and tell Mr. Callaway what I have told him before," she said, her voice carrying clean across the yard. "This land belonged to my father. It belongs to me now. No price will change that." Reese shifted in his saddle, and she could see the irritation flash across his face like heat lightning. "Now, Miss Keene, a woman alone out here, it ain't practical, you understand. The summer's been dry. Your herd is small. Come winter, you won't have the feed, won't have the hands." "I have managed thus far without Carter Callaway's concern," Elvira said, "and I will manage without it going forward. Good morning, Mr. Reese." There was a long pause during which Reese and his men exchanged a look she was not meant to see. Then Reese touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was not respect, but rather acknowledgement of a postponement, and the 3 of them turned their horses and rode back toward the ridge. Elvira waited until they were out of sight before she exhaled. She did not lower the rifle until they were gone. Only then did her hands allow themselves a small tremor, the kind that comes not from fear exactly, but from the body's honest accounting of tension held too long. She sat down on the porch step, the rifle across her knees, and looked out at her land. The grass was dry, but it was there. Her cattle, 12 head, were grazing along the creek line to the west. The farmhouse needed new shingles on the north side, and the barn door had been stuck since June. But the place was hers, and she felt that ownership in her chest like a second heartbeat. She did not look toward the old Harlan property to the north, though if she had, she might have noticed a figure on horseback standing at the tree line, watching. George Whitaker had been watching. He had arrived in Webb County 6 weeks ago with $60 in his pocket, a good horse named Cobb, a bedroll, and the particular brand of restlessness that settles into a man who has been moving for long enough that stopping starts to feel like surrender. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by years on cattle drives along the Kisham Trail, not old yet, but marked, in the way that honest work marks a man. He had brown eyes with a patient quality to them, and he spoke with deliberate care, choosing his words the way a careful man chooses his footing on uncertain ground. He had rented the old Harlan cabin for $2 a month from the county land office while he figured out what came next. The cabin sat on 5 acres adjacent to the Keene land, and he had no intention of involving himself in anyone's business. He had come to this part of Texas to rest, or at least to try resting, after 10 years of driving cattle north and spending the winters working whatever honest labor presented itself. He had saved enough money over those years to think about settling, about land of his own, and he was turning that thought over in his mind slowly, the way you turn a stone in your hand to learn its weight. In those 6 weeks, he had watched Elvira Keene work her land every single day. He had not meant to watch. It was simply the geography of the situation. Her land lay to the south and west of his cabin, and when he stepped outside in the mornings with his coffee, her farm was there, visible across the flat ground. At first he had noticed her the way you notice any neighbor, with the ordinary mild awareness of another person in proximity. But something had changed, quietly and without announcement, and by the 3rd week he was aware that he looked for her in the mornings the way a man looks for the sun to confirm the day has started. He watched her mend fence in the heat of the afternoon, driving posts with a maul that was nearly her height, working with the steady economical rhythm of someone who has long since stopped expecting help. He watched her drive her cattle to water and back, walking the creek line on foot because her horse had thrown a shoe, and she had not yet had the money to get it properly reshod. He watched her climb onto the roof of the farmhouse with a bundle of shingles on her back and spend 3 hours on a Saturday making repairs that would have taken 2 people half the time. He watched her stand up to Reese and his men. This was not the first time. It was the 4th time in 6 weeks, and each time she stood a little more alone, a little more tired, and a little more unyielding. George told himself he was not involved. He told himself it was her business and her land, and her choice how to fight for it. He told himself many sensible things while he sat in his cabin at night listening to the coyotes and thinking about the particular angle of light on her dark hair when she was working in the late afternoon. On the morning of August the 17th, 1883, which was a Friday and the hottest day of the summer so far, George rode into Laredo to buy supplies and to post a letter to his older brother in Abilene. The town of Laredo in that year was a rough and vital place, pressed against the Rio Grande with one foot always in Mexico and one in Texas, a place of commerce and conflict, and the constant negotiation between what the law said and what men with money and power actually did. The streets were packed dirt, and the buildings ran from solid stone mercantiles to canvas-roof saloons, and the whole place smelled of horses, leather, tobacco, and the particular dust of South Texas. He picked up his supplies at Morrow's dry goods, flour, salt pork, coffee, a box of ammunition, and was tying them to Cobb's saddle when he heard raised voices from the direction of the land office 2 doors down. He did not turn right away. Men raised their voices in Laredo with some regularity, and it was rarely his concern. But then he heard a woman's voice, steady and clear despite the heat of the argument, and he recognized it the way you recognize a song you've heard through a wall. He turned. Elvira was standing in the doorway of the land office, half inside and half out, and she was facing a man George had heard about but not yet met, Carter Calloway himself. Calloway was perhaps 50, thick-waisted and red-faced, wearing the kind of expensive suit that men in his position wore to remind everyone else of their position. He had silver in his hair and a gold watch chain across his vest, and he was speaking to Elvira with the tight-lipped patience of a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants and cannot understand the obstacle. "The deed is perfectly clear," Elvira was saying, her voice carrying that quality of controlled intensity that George had come to recognize from across a field. "My father registered this land in 1874. I have the papers. Your claim that there is an error in the registration is unfounded, and I suspect you know that." "Miss Keene," Calloway said, his voice dropping to a register he likely thought was reasonable, "I'm simply pointing out that the county surveyor's records show a discrepancy in the northern boundary. That is a legal matter, not a personal one. The land office agrees with me." "The land office has been agreeing with you on a great many things recently," Elvira said, and there was an edge in that sentence like a blade kept deliberately sheathed. George stood with his hand on Cobb's saddle and watched, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not yet a decision, but the shape of one beginning to form. Calloway smiled the way wealthy men smile at people they consider temporary problems. "I will give you until the end of September," he said. "After that, if the boundary dispute is not resolved, I will be forced to take legal action. And frankly, Miss Keene, a woman of your means going up against a legal claim in the courts of Webb County is not a fight I would recommend." He tipped his hat to her in the same way Reese had done, that particular Western gesture of courtesy emptied of its meaning, and walked back into the land office. Elvira stood in the doorway for a moment, and George was close enough now that he could see the fine tension in her jaw, the way she pressed her lips together and breath through her nose, working to hold everything steady. Then she turned and walked down the boardwalk in the opposite direction, her spine straight, her face giving nothing away to the people watching from the street. George stood beside Cobb for a long time after that. He went home and split firewood until his arms ached, and he had more firewood than he would need in a month. And then he sat on his porch in the cooling evening and thought about all the reasons a man with good sense minds his own business. He thought about 10 years of riding and how tired he was of things that were not his concern becoming his concern. He thought about how he was trying to build something quiet and uncomplicated. He thought about all of that, and he looked south at the light in Elvira's farmhouse window, steady as a beacon in the dark. On Saturday morning, he saddled Cobb and rode to the Keene property. He knocked on the door with his hat in his hands and waited, and when Elvira opened the door she looked at him with the controlled wariness of someone who has learned to treat unexpected visitors as probable trouble until proven otherwise. She had flour on her hands and a smudge of it on her cheek, and she was wearing a dark work dress with her hair pinned up, and she was quite simply the most capable-looking person he had seen in years. "Morning," he said. "My name is George Whitaker. I'm renting the Harlan place. I wanted to introduce myself since we're neighbors, and I also wanted to say that if you need an extra pair of hands for anything mending fence, moving cattle, roof repairs, I'm available. No pay required, just a neighbor being neighborly." Elvira looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that were doing a great deal of evaluating. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her tone polite and cautious, "I appreciate the introduction. As for the offer of help, I've been managing on my own." "I know you have," George said. "I've seen it. You work hard and you work well and you don't need anyone to do it for you. I'm not suggesting otherwise. I'm just saying that fence posts go in faster with 2 people and there's no shame in faster." Something shifted very slightly in her expression, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "The north fence needs 3 new posts," she said. "I saw that," George said. "I have a good maul." "Then I suppose you can come back Monday morning," she said, and there was a decision in her voice, not warmth exactly, not yet, but openness. A door cracked rather than closed. "Monday morning," George agreed, and put his hat back on and rode home, and he did not allow himself to acknowledge the particular quality of lightness he felt riding back, because it seemed premature and possibly foolish. Monday he came with his maul and his post digger, and they worked the north fence for most of the morning, and Elvira worked alongside him rather than directing him, which told him everything he needed to know about how she understood labor. She knew how to set a post. She knew how to judge the depth and the angle and how to pack the soil around the base to give it hold. She worked efficiently, and she did not make conversation unless she had something worth saying, which George found deeply refreshing after years on cattle drives with men who filled silence with noise to avoid thinking. By mid-morning they had set all 3 posts and strung the wire, and Elvira brought out a tin jug of water and 2 cups, and they sat in the shade of the fence line and drank, and George said, "That boundary dispute Calloway is pressing. What's the actual situation?" Elvira looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You heard that. I was at Morrow's when it happened. Hard not to hear." She set her cup down on her knee and looked out at the land. My father registered this property in 1874 under the Land Survey Act. The deed is clear, and it is documented. What Calloway is claiming is that the county surveyor made an error on the northern boundary, and that the correct line places 12 of my 40 acres within land he holds the adjacent claim to. It is not an honest claim. He wants the creek access. The creek that runs along your western edge. That is the one. It is one of the few reliable water sources in this part of the county that doesn't dry up in summer. His cattle operation to the east has been growing, and his existing water access is not adequate. My creek is the solution he wants. George was quiet for a moment. Have you got a lawyer? I cannot afford a lawyer, Elvira said, with the flat matter-of-factness of someone who has already run these numbers many times. And the lawyers in Laredo who could handle a land dispute of this kind are all on retainer to operations like Calloway's. George turned his hat in his hands. I knew a man in Abilene. Used to handle land claims. He's honest, which is rarer than it should be. I could write to him. No promises, but he might know someone in Laredo or might come himself if the case is strong enough. Elvira looked at him with that direct, measuring quality. Why would you do that? It was a fair question, and he knew it deserved a real answer. Because it's the right thing to do, he said, and because I've been watching a capable person work very hard against people who are playing with a stacked deck, and that particular kind of injustice makes me impatient. Elvira studied him for another long moment, and then she nodded once. Write your letter, she said. He wrote it that night, by the light of an oil lamp at the small table in the Harlan cabin, and he was careful with the words because he wanted them to be accurate, and because he wanted to do this one thing right for her. He came back the following Wednesday because there were 4 boards on the barn's east side that were rotting through, and they spent the afternoon replacing them. He came back the Friday after that to help move the cattle to the north pasture, where the grass was slightly better. Each time he came he worked and did not overstay and did not impose himself on her time or her space, and he was careful about this because he understood that her autonomy was not just a practical matter but a matter of deep personal meaning to her. And yet, without planning it, things began to shift. They began to talk while they worked. Not about the small, inconsequential things that serve as filler, but about real things about her father, who had come from Georgia after the war with nothing, and built this land into something through 15 years of relentless effort. About George's years on the cattle drives, the long dust-choked days and the cold nights, and the strange kinship of men who live in motion. About what it meant to want a place that was your own, a place where you knew the name of every hill and the mood of every season. Elvira told him about learning to shoot from her father at age 11, standing in this same yard, while Samuel Keene guided her hands and told her that the land would require her to know how to protect it. She told him about the year the creek flooded and took most of the south fence, and she and her father rebuilt it in 2 weeks working 12-hour days. She told him about her mother, who had died when Elvira was 9, a gentle woman named Clara who had loved flowers and grown them against every reasonable expectation in the South Texas soil. George told her things he had not said aloud to anyone in a long time. He told her about riding the Kishom Trail at 20 and the particular terror and exhilaration of the first big river crossing, the cattle surging through brown water and the boys riding alongside whooping, because being afraid and moving forward anyway is its own kind of joy. He told her about the cattle drive boss he'd worked under for 5 years, a steady old man named Aldrich who had taught him that the difference between a good man and a bad one is usually just the choices made in the moments when no one is watching. My father used to say something like that, Elvira said. They were sitting on her porch in the late afternoon, the sun going orange over the western hills, and Elvira had brought out 2 cups of coffee and they were sitting in the companionable quiet that had grown between them naturally, like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for the right season. He sounds like a man worth knowing, George said. He was, Elvira said, and there was grief in it, well-worn but honest, the kind of grief that does not need to perform itself. He would have liked you, I think. He had no patience for men who talked big and worked small. You work the way he worked, like the work itself matters, not just the result. George looked at the side of her face in the amber light and felt something he had been carefully not feeling come fully into focus. He looked away before she turned, and he took a long drink of his coffee and thought about Aldrich's lesson about the choices made when no one is watching, except someone was watching in a sense. He was watching himself. And he did not know yet what the right choice was, only that the wrong one would be to move too fast and frighten away something that was growing with the quiet tenacity of the creek grass after rain. His letter to James Whitmore in Abilene came back in early September with good news. Whitmore was coming south on other business in 3 weeks and would stop in Laredo, and he had already, on George's description of the case, pulled up what public land records he could access and believed Calloway's boundary claim was either a deliberate fabrication or based on a fraudulent survey. He could not promise a resolution, but he believed Elvira had a strong case. George brought the letter to Elvira on a Sunday afternoon. She read it standing at her kitchen table, and when she looked up there was something in her eyes that he had not seen before, a particular mixture of relief and emotion that she was working hard to contain, pressing her lips together and straightening her shoulders. "This could actually help," she said, and her voice was carefully steady. "I believe it can," George said. There was a pause, and then Elvira said very quietly, "Thank you, George." It was the first time she had used his given name. He registered it the way you register the first warm day after a long winter, not with fanfare but with a kind of full-bodied recognition. "You don't need to thank me," he said. He stopped. "Just what?" she asked. "Just let me keep helping," he said. "That's all I'm asking." She looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them in that look, an acknowledgment not yet spoken of the thing that had been growing in the spaces between their conversations and their shared labor. Then she nodded, and the corner of her mouth lifted, and it was the closest thing to a full smile he had seen from her, and it hit him with the force of something long hoped for. In the weeks that followed, September cooling the mornings and easing the brutal heat of the Texas summer into something more habitable, George and Elvira fell into a rhythm that was both practical and deeply personal. He was at the Keene farm 3 or 4 mornings a week. He helped her drive the cattle in, helped repair the equipment that had been failing through the summer, helped lay in the stores she would need for winter. He was careful to work with her rather than for her, always asking what she wanted done, always following her lead about how it should be done, because he had seen clearly enough that her independence was not stubbornness but integrity, and he respected it the way you respect anything that has been tested and held. And they talked. God, how they talked. In the long golden evenings of September, with the land cooling around them, and the stars coming out big and low over the Texas hills, they sat on her porch or walked the fence line in the dusk and talked about everything. They argued, too, about the best way to manage a small herd through winter, about whether the rotting well cover could be repaired or needed replacing entirely, about the politics of the frontier, the railroads pushing west, and what that meant for the small landowners and the people who had been here longest. On the question of the Comanche and the Apache and all the nations that had been pushed from this land, Elvira had a directness that George had not expected and found he deeply appreciated. "My father used to say that the law has a way of following power rather than justice," she told him one evening. "He did not think what was done to the people who lived here first was right. He said that a man who takes land by force and calls it legal settlement is only as honest as the force that backs him, and that's an uncomfortable truth to sit with if you're a settler." "And what do you think?" George asked. "I think he was right," she said. "I think about it when men like Calloway come for my 40 acres. I wonder sometimes what the people who lived on this land before my father think of the whole business, One set of settlers using the law to push out another set of settlers while everyone argues about deeds and boundaries. That's a hard thing to sit with, George said. Yes, said Elvira, but hard things deserve sitting with. He liked her enormously. He liked her mind and her honesty and her refusal to make things simpler than they were. He liked the way she worked. He liked the sound of her voice in the evenings. He liked the way she had begun, in recent weeks, to lean toward him slightly when she was making a point, as though proximity helped the meaning travel. He had not said any of this to her because the time for it had not come, and because there was still the matter of the land dispute which was coming to a head in a way that made him uneasy. James Whitmore arrived in Laredo on the 15th of September and met with Elvira and George at the land office. He was a compact, sharp-eyed man of 45 with a precise manner and an absolute refusal to be impressed by anyone on the basis of their wealth or their bluster. He reviewed the original survey documents and the Keene deed and Calloway's counterclaim, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, with the particular calm of a man who has seen many such situations, "This counterclaim is based on a survey conducted in June of this year by a surveyor named Tobias Crane. Mr. Crane has, in the past 3 years, produced survey results that are favorable to Carter Calloway's land interests in 6 separate instances. That is a pattern worth examining." "He's a bought man," Elvira said. "That would be my reading," Whitmore agreed. "What you need is the original 1874 survey documentation and potentially a new independent survey. If the original documentation confirms the deed, which I believe it will, then Calloway's claim falls apart." "Where is the 1874 documentation?" George asked. "The State Land Office in Austin," Whitmore said. "The county copy may have been interfered with. I notice there is a page missing from the county record that should be there. The state copy is the authoritative one." Elvira pressed her hands flat on the table. "Can you get it?" "I can request it. It will take 2 to 3 weeks by mail." In the meantime, Calloway's deadline at the end of September is not legally binding. It is a pressure tactic. You do not have to meet his deadline, Miss Keene. What you have to do is file a formal contest with the county land office before that date, which puts the dispute into official legal review and prevents any unilateral action on the county's part. "File the contest," Elvira said immediately. "That is what I would recommend," Whitmore said. "And I would be willing to assist with the filing and the subsequent case, at a reduced rate given the circumstances." He glanced at George with a look that said, "You vouched for this woman and she is worth vouching for." George held his eyes and nodded. They filed the contest that afternoon. Calloway's legal representative, a thin-faced man named Crawford, was in the land office when they did it, and his expression upon seeing James Whitmore was one of poorly concealed consternation. Calloway had clearly not anticipated a genuine legal opposition. Walking out of the land office into the September afternoon, Elvira exhaled long and slow. George walked beside her and they went down the boardwalk together, and then out to where Cobb and Elvira's roan horse were tied at the post, and Elvira stood with her hand on her horse's neck and was quiet for a moment. "This is not over," she said. "No," George agreed. "But it's different now. You've got a weapon that matters in this fight." She turned to look at him, and the afternoon sun was on her face and her dark eyes were very serious. "I do not know what I would have done without you," she said. "And I do not say that lightly because I have been very careful about not depending on anyone." "I know you have," George said. "It frightens me a little," she said, and there was a candor in it that took something from him, some careful guard he had been maintaining. "Being able to trust someone again, it has been a long time." "Me too," he said. It was not quite what he had meant to say, but it was true, and that made it right. They stood for a moment in that particular way of two people standing near each other who want to close the distance and are both still deciding whether to. Then Elvira said, "Will you come for supper on Sunday? I make a decent beef stew and you have been eating your own cooking for 6 weeks." "My cooking is adequate," George said. "Come anyway," she said. "Sunday," he said. "Yes." He rode home in the long light of the afternoon, feeling something he had not felt in years, the particular warmth of being wanted. Not needed for what he could do, but wanted for who he was. The distinction mattered to him more than he could have easily explained. Sunday supper was the most pleasant evening George had spent since he could not remember when. Elvira's farmhouse was small, but she had made it genuinely a home. There were curtains at the windows in a deep red fabric, and a framed photograph of her parents on the mantel, and the small herb garden she kept just outside the kitchen door gave the whole place a clean, living smell. The stew was excellent. There was bread she had made that morning, still warm, and dried apple preserves that she had put up last fall. They ate at the kitchen table and talked all through supper and all through the cleaning up, and afterwards sat in the front room as the evening cooled and the crickets took up their constant song outside, and George thought he had never felt more at home somewhere that was not his. "Tell me what you want," Elvira said. She was sitting across from him in the room's one good chair, her feet tucked up beneath her and a cup of coffee in her hands. "Not what you are doing now. What you want. For your life." George thought about it properly rather than giving a quick answer. "Land," he said finally. "Something I can work and know. Not a big operation, I don't have the appetite for that. 30 or 40 acres, good water, good grass, a place where I know the seasons." And he stopped, and she prompted. "Someone to share it with," he said. "That's the part I've been missing. The work is fine alone, but the evenings are long." Elvira looked at him very steadily. "Yes," she said, "they are." Another silence, and this one was full of the thing they had both been circling. George set down his coffee cup and leaned forward in his chair, his elbows on his knees, looking at her directly. "Elvira," he said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly." "Then say it plainly," she said. "I have been in love with you since sometime in August," he said. "I cannot tell you the exact day because it did not happen in a day. It happened the way rain soaks into ground, gradually and completely. I know this land and this fight for it are yours, and I am not trying to insert myself into either. I am just telling you that the feelings are there, and I thought you ought to know." Elvira looked at him for a long time, and in the lamplight her face was very serious, and also something else, something that was opening, like a window. "George," she said, "I have been telling myself since August that what I was feeling for you was gratitude. And," he said, "and I am a very honest person," she said. "And I cannot maintain that particular untruth any longer." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and then they were both smiling, the kind of full, helpless smiling that comes when something true has finally been said, and you can't contain the relief and joy of it. He moved to where she sat and crouched down so they were at eye level, and he reached out and took her hand carefully in both of his, and she turned her hand over and held his back, and it was the simplest and most significant thing. "I want to court you properly," he said, "if you'll permit it." "I will permit it," she said, "on the condition that you remain as you have been, honest with me, useful without being presumptuous, and willing to argue when I am wrong." "I can absolutely commit to all of those," he said. "Then we have an agreement," she said, and squeezed his hands. He walked home under a sky thick with stars that night, and he looked up at the Milky Way spread from horizon to horizon the way it does in South Texas, enormous and ancient and indifferent. And he thought that there are moments in a life when the world lines up in a way that feels deliberate, and this was one of those. October came in cooler and clear, and Whitmore's request to the State Land Office produced the 1874 survey documentation in the third week of the month. The document was exactly what Elvira's deed had promised, a clean, accurate survey that placed the northern boundary precisely where Samuel Keene had always said it was, and showed unambiguously that the creek and all 40 acres were legitimately registered Keene land. When Whitmore laid the document on the table at the land office, Calloway's man Crawford tried to argue that the state document might also contain an error, and Whitmore looked at him with the cold patience of a man who has been a lawyer for 20 years and said, "You are welcome to challenge the State Land Office's documentation in a court of law. I would be very interested to see that proceeding." Crawford had nothing further to say. The county land office officially dismissed Calloway's boundary claim on the 24th of October, 1883. The dismissal was formal and documented and binding, and Elvira stood in the land office with her copy of the ruling in her hands and read it twice, very carefully, and then she looked up at George standing beside her. "It is done," she said. "It's done," he confirmed. She reached out and took hold of his arm with both hands, the ruling still in one of hers, and she held on, and George covered her hands with his, and neither of them spoke for a moment because the moment did not need words. Calloway was furious. That was known around Laredo within days, because Carter Calloway's fury was not a quiet thing. He had made a significant investment in his legal strategy, and he had lost it to a woman with a good deed and a lawyer from Abilene. And this did not sit well with a man of his particular character. There were ugly things said about Elvira in certain establishments in town, the kind of dismissive and demeaning language that men like Calloway use about women who refuse to be managed, and George heard some of it and felt a white-hot anger about it that he controlled carefully. Elvira heard some of it too, as she always did, because she was not the sort of person who isolated herself from information. She heard it and she squared her jaw and she went about her work, because she had learned long ago that the opinion of men like Calloway was not worth the energy of a response. But Calloway was not finished. In the first week of November, Dade Reese and 4 riders came to the Keene property at dawn. Not to talk this time. George woke early that morning, as he usually did, and when he stepped outside with his coffee he saw, in the gray pre-dawn light, the shapes of horses at Elvira's fence line. 5 horses. Reese's particular tall bay was unmistakable even in the dark. He did not hesitate. He went back inside, put on his boots and his coat, loaded his rifle and his sidearm, and was on Cobb and riding south in under 3 minutes. He came around the eastern edge of Elvira's property as the sky was just beginning to lighten, and he heard, before he could see clearly, the sounds of raised voices, and then the sound of Elvira's voice, that steady carrying tone he knew so well, but underneath it something different, a quality of strain, of being pushed. He came around the barn at a canter and pulled Cobb up at the edge of the yard. Reese and 2 of his men were on foot, standing in Elvira's yard. The other 2 were still mounted at the gate. Elvira was on her porch with her Winchester, but Reese had positioned himself in a way that made it difficult for her to cover all of them simultaneously, and one of the men on foot had moved to her right, close to the corner of the porch. "What's this?" George said. His voice was very quiet and very level, and it cut through the morning air like a thrown blade. Reese turned. Whatever he had expected to see at this hour, it was not George Whitaker sitting on a horse with a rifle at rest in his hands and a look in his eyes that said quite clearly he had not ridden across the dark field to witness a conversation. "Whitaker," Reese said, "this is no concern of yours." "Keene's property is my concern," George said. "She is a friend and I am her neighbor, and I am asking you, once, civilly, to get your men back on their horses and off this property. Mr. Calloway has sent us to—" "I don't care what Mr. Calloway has sent you to do," George said, still quiet, still level. "I care that there are 5 men on one woman's land at 5 in the morning and she did not invite you. That is trespassing under Texas law, Mr. Reese, and I suspect you know it." There was a pause in which the gray morning held its breath. Reese looked at George. He looked at Elvira on the porch with her Winchester aimed and steady. He looked at the 2 men on foot with him, one of whom was visibly uncomfortable in a way that suggested he had not fully signed on for whatever Calloway had in mind at this hour, and then he looked back at George. "This is going to be remembered," Reese said. "I expect so," George said. "I will remember it quite clearly, including the date and the hour. I believe Mr. Whitmore will find that useful documentation." Another pause, and then Reese made a short gesture to his men and they mounted. Reese spent a moment looking at Elvira on her porch with an expression that was its own threat, and then he turned his horse, and the 5 of them rode out. George stayed where he was until they were well off the property, and then he swung down from Cobb and walked to the porch. Elvira had lowered the rifle. She was standing with it at her side, and he could see in the morning light that her face was tightly composed, and he could also see, because he knew her face well by now, the fine control it was taking to keep it that way. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "Was anyone? They had not done anything yet," she said. I do not know what they would have done. They were," she stopped and took a breath. "They were trying to frighten me. They may have intended to damage the property. I do not know." George stepped up onto the porch. He stood close to her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold morning, and he said, "It's all right. They're gone." And then Elvira Keene, who had been fighting alone for 6 months, who had repaired fences and confronted riders and faced down powerful men with nothing but her father's rifle and her own iron will, pressed her forehead against George's shoulder for just a moment. Her eyes were closed and her jaw was tight, and she held on to that moment of leaning, as though it were a thing she had been saving for a time of genuine need. George put his hand on her back gently and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the gesture did not already contain. After a moment she straightened and stepped back, and there were no tears. She was not a person who cried often, but her eyes were very bright. "I am tired," she said, "of doing this alone." "You are not alone anymore," George said, "if that is acceptable." She looked at him, and there was no measuring now, no guarded evaluating, just a woman looking at a man she trusted and saying, with her eyes and then with words, "It is acceptable. It is very acceptable." He stayed for breakfast, and they wrote out a detailed account of the morning's event, and sent it by writer to James Whitmore in Abilene, and Whitmore, who had been expecting something of this nature, filed it with the county sheriff as official documentation of harassment and trespassing. He also sent a letter directly to Carter Calloway, on legal letterhead, detailing the potential civil and criminal liabilities of any further interference with Elvira Keene's property or person. Carter Calloway was a ruthless man, but he was also a practical one. He had lost the legal battle. He was now facing documented evidence of trespassing and harassment. He had a lawyer from Abilene who was clearly not going to be intimidated. The calculus had changed. In the second week of November, Dade Reese was seen leaving Laredo on the westbound road with his belongings on a pack horse, which told the story efficiently enough. 2 weeks after that, Calloway himself sold a portion of his eastern holdings and moved his primary operation north toward San Antonio, which was generally understood in Laredo as a man cutting his losses and relocating his attention. The threat to Elvira's land was over. She stood at the edge of her north fence on the morning she heard about Calloway's departure and looked out at the 40 acres her father had carved out of the Texas ground, and the creek ran clearly in the west, and the cattle moved slowly across the dried autumn grass, and the sky above was the particular pale blue of a Texas November morning, cool and clear as water, and she felt the land under her feet the way she always did, like a heartbeat, like a promise kept. George came to stand beside her, and they stood together at the fence line without speaking, and after a while Elvira said, "He did this for 15 years alone. My father. All of this, building it, protecting it, growing it. 15 years before I was old enough to really help him. He did a fine piece of work," George said. "He did," said Elvira. She paused. "I think he would be glad today." "I think so too," George said. She turned to look at him fully then in the clear November light, and she said, "George, I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me the same way." "Always," he said. "You said you wanted land of your own, 30 or 40 acres, good water. Do you still want that?" He met her eyes. "Yes. And the someone to share it with," she said. "Do you still want that?" "Very much so," he said. Elvira looked at him for a long, full moment, and he could see that she was both certain and a little frightened, which he understood because he felt the same way, and certainty and fear are not, in fact, mutually exclusive. "I am not asking you to take over my land," she said carefully. "I am asking you if you would like to share it, as an equal, as a partner, as a husband, if that is something you want." George Whitaker looked at the woman who had driven fence posts alone in the August heat and stood down armed men on her porch and argued for justice with the precision of someone who had thought hard about what justice means. And he said, "Elvira, I would be honored. I would be the most honored man in Webb County." She breathed out, and the smile that broke across her face was the kind that rewrites a person's whole expression, full and genuine and lit from within. She stepped forward, and he stepped forward, and he took her face in his hands the way you hold something of great value, and he kissed her, there at the north fence of the Keene land with the November sky above them, and the creek running silver in the west and the cattle moving slow and easy across the grass. She kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything fully, honestly, without reservation. They were married on the 14th of December, 1883, at the small church in Laredo. It was not a large wedding. James Whitmore came down from Abilene and stood for George, and Elvira's only close friend in the county, a woman named Marta Delgado who ran the dry goods counter at Morrow's, stood with her. The minister was a quiet, sincere man named Reverend Ames who had known Elvira since her father's funeral, and who married them with a warmth that felt genuinely felt. Elvira wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over 3 evenings in November, and her hair was down for the occasion, long and dark and pinned with 2 small pearl pins that had been her mother Clara's. George wore his best clothes, which were not particularly fine but were clean and pressed with care, and he looked at Elvira in that blue dress in the church doorway, and felt the particular combination of profound happiness and slight unreality that attends the moments when the best things in your life actually happen. They said their vows in plain language, meaning every word. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was cold but not brutal, and they spent it well. George's few possessions moved from the Harlan cabin to the Keene farmhouse, and in the daily domestic geography of 2 lives combining, they discovered what they had already known, that they fit together in the way of people who are genuinely compatible, who have compatible rhythms and compatible values, and the mutual respect that makes the small difficulties of shared life manageable rather than grinding. George repaired the north side of the roof that January, working in the cold with his breath making clouds, and Elvira brought him coffee and held the ladder and handed up shingles, and they argued cheerfully about the best angle for nailing them, and it was the happiest repair job George had ever done. In February, he broke ground on a small addition to the east side of the farmhouse, a proper second bedroom, because they had spoken with the hopeful practicality of people who intended to fill it, and Elvira helped him frame it and was relentlessly useful, and also brought an aesthetic eye to the details that George honestly lacked. By spring of 1884, the Keene-Whitaker operation, which was what George had taken to calling it, insisting that the Keene name stay because it belonged to the land, and the land had earned it, was in better shape than it had been since before Samuel Keene's death. They had expanded the herd to 20 head. They had planted a small kitchen garden that was already showing green shoots by April. The farmhouse was solid and warm and genuinely repaired, and the addition was finished and bright, with a window that caught the morning sun. In April, Elvira told George she was expecting. She told him on a Sunday morning, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee, in exactly the direct way she told him everything. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. "By my reckoning, in November." George set down his cup very carefully and looked at her and felt something move through him that was too large for words, a kind of enormous, hushed gratitude. "Elvira," he said. "I am hoping for your opinion on names," she said, and her voice was steady but her eyes were very bright. "November," he said. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down and took her hands in his, and she looked at him, and they were both smiling in that full, unhelpable way. "I am well," she said, because she knew he would ask. "I feel well, I am not concerned." "I know you are not," he said. "You are the least concernable person I know." "That is not a word," she said. "I'm making it one," he he said, and she laughed, a genuine, clear laugh that he could have listened to for the rest of his life. The spring and summer of 1884 were busy and good. Elvira worked through her pregnancy with the same capable pragmatism she brought to everything, adjusting what needed adjusting and refusing to treat herself as an invalid. And George had learned enough about her by now to support her in this, rather than trying to wrap her in cotton wool. He took on more of the heavier physical work without making a production of it, and she managed the cattle operations and the accounts with an efficiency that never ceased to impress him. They expanded the garden. They got a second horse, a good steady gray mare that Elvira named Pearl, after her mother's hairpins. George built a proper chicken coop, and they got 6 hens, which Elvira declared a significant improvement to their food situation. They planted a section of the south field with winter wheat on the advice of a neighbor down the county road, a grizzled old farmer named Hutchins who had been growing wheat alongside his cattle operation for a decade. In the evenings of that long good summer, they sat on the porch they had expanded together, wider now, with a second chair and a small table between them, and watched the light change over the Texas hills, and talked about everything and nothing. And George would sometimes reach over and take her hand and she would hold it, and neither of them needed to say anything about what this was because what this was had been established and was certain and required no further words. On the 8th of November, 1884, their son was born. He was a healthy, loud, red-faced boy who announced himself to the world with a vigor that Elvira declared appropriate given his heritage. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Ochoa, who had delivered babies in Webb County for 30 years, pronounced him the most determined infant she had seen in recent memory, which George and Elvira took as a compliment. They named him Samuel George Whitaker, Samuel for Elvira's father, George because George had protested that it was unnecessary, and Elvira had fixed him with a look that closed the discussion. The boy had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn set of jaw, and from his first week in the world it was clear that he intended to make his presence known in it. George held his son on the first evening of Samuel's life, sitting in the chair by the fireplace with the baby wrapped in the blanket Marta Delgado had given them, and looked at the small face with the enormous quiet feeling of a man who has received something he did not know he had been hoping for. Elvira was watching him from the bed, tired but deeply awake, her face having the particular quality it sometimes had after great effort stripped of any performance, entirely itself. "He looks like you," George said. "He looks like a potato," Elvira said. "But he is our potato and I love him completely." George looked up at her and laughed, and she laughed, and Samuel made a small, indignant sound at being jostled, and the firelight was warm and the November wind pressed at the windows and could not get in. The years that followed were full years, full of work and weather and growth and the daily texture of a life genuinely shared. Their herd grew steadily, and by 1886 they had expanded to 60 head and hired a young hand named Tomás Delgado, Marta's nephew, a 16-year-old who was hardworking and quick to learn, and who was treated by both George and Elvira with the honest respect and fair wages that he earned. He grew with the operation and stayed, and by the time he was 19, he was running the morning cattle work with a competence that allowed George and Elvira to focus on the expanding side of the operation. In the spring of 1887, Elvira discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was easy, as the first had been, and on a bright October morning their second child arrived, a girl this time, small and fair-haired in a way that puzzled everyone briefly, until Elvira remembered that her mother Clara had been fair-haired, and then it made perfect sense. They named her Clara, and Samuel, who was nearly 3, inspected his sister with the serious evaluative attention of a small person confronted with something new and potentially significant, and then apparently decided she was acceptable, which Clara spent the next several years vigorously confirming. The Keene Whitaker farm in 1887 was a different place from the tired, beleaguered 40 acres of 1883. The farmhouse was solid and well-maintained, the addition long since integrated into the whole. The porch stretched the full width of the front, and Elvira had planted the flower garden her mother had always wanted, and in spring it bloomed in colors that could be seen from the road. The wheat field in the south was in its third productive year. The cattle operation was established and respected in the county. The well had been properly relined, and there was a new water trough by the barn. The creek still ran clear and silver along the western edge of the property, and Elvira still walked to it in the morning sometimes, as she always had, standing at its edge in the early light with her coffee, and listening to the sound of the water, which had the same quality it had always had, the sound of something that belongs entirely to itself, and keeps faith with its own nature regardless of what goes on around it. George would find her there sometimes, come to stand beside her, and they would drink their coffee at the creek's edge in the morning quiet together. And he would think about the August morning when he had watched her stand at her porch with her rifle and face down 3 riders alone, and about the distance between that morning and this one. And it seemed to him like a very great distance measured not in miles or months, but in the depth of a life that had opened. In the fall of 1888, James Whitmore came through Laredo on legal business and stopped at the Keene Whitaker farm for supper, and he sat at the kitchen table where Samuel and Clara had been put to bed and ate Elvira's excellent chicken and dumplings, and said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who practices justice for its own sake, Carter Calloway's San Antonio operation went bankrupt in June. He is, by last report, working as a clerk in a land office in Dallas. George and Elvira looked at each other across the table. I find I do not feel satisfaction at that, Elvira said after a moment. No, Whitmore said, I feel nothing mostly. He was a man who believed that power entitled him to take what was not his, and he was wrong, and the world demonstrated that. That seems like a sufficient resolution. She reached for the bread. I was never angry at him for being Calloway. I was angry at the situation, and the situation is resolved. That is a very measured response, Whitmore said. I have a great deal to be occupied with, Elvira said. I do not have the energy to maintain old grievances. George looked at her and felt the same thing he felt every day, a deep, uncomplicated gratitude for the specific person she was. Whitmore stayed the night in the room that had been the addition, and in the morning before he rode back to Laredo, he stood on the porch with George while Elvira was getting the children dressed, and he said, I want to tell you something. When you wrote to me about this case in 1883, I came because you asked and I trusted your judgment. But what I found when I got here was a woman fighting a completely legitimate fight completely alone, and I have thought about it many times since. There are a great many people in this country fighting that kind of fight with no one to write a letter on their behalf. Yes, George said. He looked out at the morning land. I know it. You did a good thing stepping in, Whitmore said. I just wanted to say that. George was quiet for a moment. She would have won it without me eventually, he said. She was never going to give up. Maybe, Whitmore said, but she should not have had to fight it alone, and she did not have to because you were there. Whitmore rode out after breakfast, and George stood on the porch and watched the road. And then he heard behind him the sound of small feet on the floorboards, and Samuel appeared in the doorway, dark-eyed and disheveled, and carrying in one hand a tin cup, and in the other a piece of bread he had apparently taken from the kitchen without authorization. Pa, Samuel said. Tamaz says we are moving the cattle today. Can I help? After you finish that bread and put the cup back where it belongs, George said. Samuel regarded this condition gravely and then accepted it. He ate the bread in the doorway with the focused attention of a small person who understands that a negotiation has been completed in his favor and does not wish to press his luck. George watched him and put his hand on the boy's head. Elvira appeared behind Samuel with Clara on her hip. Clara, who was 11 months old and working on her first words with great determination, and Elvira looked at Samuel and his cup and said, "I see," in a tone that communicated a full sentence, and Samuel handed over the cup with the expression of someone managing a graceful retreat. George looked at his wife and his children in the doorway of the farmhouse on the good morning land, and the creek was catching the early light to the west, and the cattle were making their slow morning sounds in the north pasture, and Samuel was asking again about helping with the cattle drive today, and Clara had taken hold of Elvira's braid and was examining it with scientific interest, and Elvira was saying something to Samuel about boots while also gently disengaging her hair from Clara's grip. And all of it, the ordinary daily fullness of it, seemed to George, as it did every morning, like the most remarkable thing. He had come to this county as a man in motion, carrying the particular restlessness of someone who had been moving long enough that rest felt like a kind of defeat. He had thought rest might mean stopping. He had found, instead, that it meant this noise and warmth and consequence, this land under his feet that he knew now in every season, this woman who had taught him, by example, that the most courageous thing a person can do is hold what is theirs and keep faith with what matters. He stepped back into the house and took Clara from Elvira's hip so she could finish lacing Samuel's boots, and Clara grabbed immediately for his beard with the exploratory confidence of someone who has done this before and found it consistently interesting, and George said, "Good morning, Clara," and Clara said something that was either a word or the beginning of one, and Samuel said, "Pa, she said cattle," and Elvira looked up from the boots and said, "She absolutely did not say cattle." And Samuel said, "She did, Mama, I heard it," and Elvira said, "She is 11 months old," and Samuel said, "She is very smart," and George laughed, which made Clara laugh, which made Samuel laugh, and even Elvira was smiling as she finished the boots and stood up. Outside, the Texas morning was everything it always was, enormous and clear and indifferent to human concern, the sky going blue from the pale milk of dawn, the creek running its silver course to the west, the land stretching in all directions with the patient permanence of ground that has been here long before any claim was made to it and will be here long after. But within that enormous indifference, in the particular 40 acres that bore the Keene name, there was warmth and purpose and love, and the sound of a family going about its morning. Elvira picked up her coffee from the table and came to stand beside George on the porch, and he put his arm around her, Clara on his other hip still examining his beard, and Samuel had already gone to find Tamaz because the cattle needed moving and a boy of 4 has priorities. "What are you thinking about?" Elvira asked. "About how I almost didn't come over that Saturday morning," George said. "In August of '83, I almost talked myself out of it." Elvira looked at him sideways. "What changed your mind?" "I thought about the fence posts," he said. "I thought that fence posts go in faster with 2 people, and there is no shame in faster, and it seemed like a reason solid enough to act on." Elvira turned to look at him fully, and in her face was the particular expression he had come to know as well as his own, direct and warm and entirely honest. "George," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad you came over," she said. He kissed her temple carefully so as not to disturb Clara's ongoing beard investigation. "So am I," he said. "More than I can tell you." From the north pasture came Tamaz's distant whistle and the answering sound of cattle beginning to move, and from somewhere around the barn Samuel shouted something enthusiastic and probably unauthorized, and the creek ran its faithful course to the west, and the land held them all in the quiet, permanent way that land holds what belongs to it, and the morning opened around them like something that had been waiting a long time to begin. The winter of 1889 brought heavy snow that was unusual for that part of Texas, and George and Elvira spent 3 days and nights working alongside Tamaz to move the cattle into the sheltered draw on the north side of the property, where the hills broke the worst of the wind, and they lost 2 head to the cold, which was a hard loss. But the rest of the herd came through, and by February, the pastures were showing the first green again. Samuel was 5 and decided during that winter that he was old enough to help with the cattle work, and George spent several careful afternoons teaching him the basics of working with animals. How to move slowly and with intention, how to read the direction of a herd's attention, how to be useful without being in the way. Samuel was a fast learner with an impatience that was familiar in its genetics, and Elvira watched from the fence line one afternoon as George knelt beside their son in the field and showed him how to read the grass for signs of good ground and poor, and she felt the particular complete satisfaction of a woman who has built something that is worth building. Clara, at 18 months, had become a force of personality in the household that her size gave no indication of. She had opinions about everything and communicated them with increasing linguistic precision and an expression of absolute authority that made Elvira say on one occasion, "She gets that look from you," and George said, "She certainly does not get that look from me," and Samuel said, with the wisdom of 5 years, "She gets it from both of you," and both George and Elvira looked at their son and then at each other, and the fairness of this observation could not be disputed. Marta Delgado came for Sunday dinners regularly now, and she and Elvira had the deep, comfortable friendship of women who have known each other through difficulty and come out the other side. And at these dinners, the table was loud and full, and the kind of happy that requires no maintenance. In the spring of 1890, George bought the Harlan 5 acres, the parcel he had originally rented from the county, and officially added it to the Keene Whitaker land, making the total 45 acres, and he and Tamaz and a grown-up Samuel, who was 6 and very serious about his participation, planted the new acreage in a combination of wheat and pasture that would feed the herd through the following winter. Elvira had walked the new acreage with George on the morning the deed came through, the two of them moving through the spring grass in the early light, and at the northern edge she stopped and looked back south across all of it, the original 40 acres, the farmhouse with the flower garden bright in the distance, the creek catching the morning, the cattle moving in the western pasture, and now these 5 new acres of good Texas ground. "My father came here with nothing," she said, "and made something, and I almost lost it." And then she stopped and looked at George. "And then," he said, she took his hand. "And then I did not lose it," she said, "and it became more." He held her hand in both of his and looked at her in the morning light, and he thought, "This is what I came to this county looking for without knowing what I was looking for. Not land, though the land was good and he loved it. Not rest, though he had found rest here. But this woman and this place and this life that she had held together with her own 2 hands until he had been wise enough to come and hold it with her." "Elvira," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said. "I want to say it out loud here on our land, because it seems like the right place to say it." She looked at him with all the directness and honesty that was her essential nature, and she said, "I love you, George Whitaker, every single day." The creek ran to the west, and the spring birds made their noise in the mesquite, and somewhere behind them at the farmhouse, Clara was declaring herself awake to the morning in the way she always did, loudly and with conviction, and George squeezed Elvira's hand, and she squeezed his back, and they stood together on the Keene Whitaker land in the clear Texas morning, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be built had been built. And the land was theirs, and so was everything on it, and the day was full of work, and they went to meet it together.